Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Global 360, a new digital platform of the Washington Diplomat. We are certainly glad that all of you are with us. It's a rainy, dreary day here in Washington, D.C., but I think we've got a topic today that will certainly lighten the mood. If not lighten the mood, definitely will keep everyone interested and spirits really high. But before we get to our topic and our guest today, I want to first thank our sponsors for our webcast. We want to thank Sahuri Insurance as well as Cigna for their support for this program, for this project that we have launched, making sure that we stay connected to our audience in the digital world right now. And let me lay out the topic that we're going to talk about today. And this is a very complex topic that we're looking at. And this is the US-China relationship and the tensions that have been playing out between the two countries. And we have seen the back and forth, the retaliation between the United States and China. And these tensions have been raging. And it's having a massive impact on the world because we're talking about the two largest economies that are right now locked into a battle of wills. And right now, the question is, which one of these massive economic powers will blink first? And to explore these issues and to grapple with these critical questions, I have with me my good friend, DeWardric McNeal. He is a China expert, having served at the Brookings Institute as the deputy director of the China program. He's also served in the Obama administration, working on China affairs. And now he's providing his expertise to CNBC on many of these intractable issues. So DeWardric, we certainly want to thank you for being with us today. And I want to start at the 30,000 foot view, because right now we're all looking at what's happening in the moment, particularly as it relates to the back and forth over the consulate. But let's go back a little bit. And I want to open it up, give you the floor, and just kind of explain to our audience, in fact, how we actually got here and what it means to how we got here and where possibly we will go from here.
Thank you, Eric, and also thank you to the Washington Diplomat and to the sponsors and to everyone who's decided to spend a rainy Friday afternoon with the two of us as we continue to talk about issues that we've spent many years talking and debating and arguing about. Listen, I think you raise an interesting point, and that is, yes, the relationship today is probably more toxic than most people have seen it. But it is very important to note that many of these issues, not all, but many of these issues have been around the US-China relationship for a very long time. The difference, Eric, I think, is the degree to which the general public is being brought right into these debates and the degree to which the administration is prepared to talk very openly about some of these challenges. But if you take an issue, for example, like Xinjiang, you know, back in 2001, I was a young analyst at the Congressional Research Service, and I wrote a report about China's first Go West campaign and the issues that they were having with the Hanification, the movement of Han Chinese into Xinjiang. You know, unfortunately, Uyghurs did not have a charismatic single leader like the Dalai Lama or any Hollywood support that could really elevate their issues. But these issues have been around for almost 20 years or more. So it's important to understand that as much as we want to dial in on today, these issues have been around for a long time. The South China Sea, for example, you know, one of my first duties in the Obama administration when I joined was to staff the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense in August of 2009 to a trip to Beijing to conduct the military maritime consultation agreement talks. This was about the South China Sea. Now, true, these were technical talks that spoke about how professional navies were to conduct themselves as they had encounters in the South China Sea. But certainly the Chinese understood our views about their excessive claims in the 9-dash line. And so this was 2009. So, you know, these issues have been around for sure. Huawei, I'll stop there. but I have to mention Huawei as well, because today we know Huawei. It's all over the news, but Huawei has been around for a long time as a concern for the U.S. government, particularly the security community. In 2012, you may recall this, Eric, there was a story about the African Union, and every single night at a specific time, computers would be downloaded from the African Union. And this was the first time that people, at least in the US government, started to think about whether or not there was a back door. Huawei has denied this, of course, but whether there was a back door in Huawei technology. The House Intelligence Committee did a long report in 2012 about this issue. So, Huawei as well has been around for a very long time. I think the difference is in many ways, the 2017 national security strategy, where for the first time, an administration named names, said China, and said very, very specifically that we are moving into a space of competition more so than cooperation. And what's amazing to those of us who do China is that many people today, fast forward to 2020, are surprised by what we're seeing. But the surprise should be, I guess, that we actually did something that we said we were going to do in a national security strategy, because it's all spelled out there what at least the Trump administration was going to do. And finally, I will say that a lot of the talk about the toxicity in the relationship being Trump focused does bother me a little bit. Look, we understand how polarizing Donald Trump is. For many, we understand that he's a lightning rod, and it's easy to latch anything that you disagree with or hate on Trump's back. But to be fair, these issues predate him. Now, we can argue about whether or not his approach has worked any better than the one that he criticized when he came into power. But these issues, many of them, have been around. Now, Hong Kong is new, of course. Pandemic and COVID-19, these are all new issues that have managed to add additional toxicity to the relationship. But some of those others, it's fair to say, predate Trump and will be here long after he is gone.
And picking up on what you're saying, what we're seeing here is these are like many moments and entities that only highlight the relationship now, that this is a competition that we're talking about, not a relationship. And it's a competition because China, I remember back when Bush was still in office, and I was at CSIS at the time, and I'm blanking on the president of China then, but he came and there was this big state event that was held for him, and we had this project called the China Balance Sheet. And we were looking at China then, talking about China in terms of China is rising. China is rising. Well, now it's China has risen. And now we're beginning to see China begin to flex that muscle. And yesterday, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, he testified before Congress. And what he said to the members of Congress, I think, illustrate and highlight that now you've got these two major powers that are in this competition. And again, when we look at these lightning rod issues, it only highlights that there is this competition. And I think it exacerbates, and I think it makes it a concern for, China watchers like you and I, but also just for the United States from a national security standpoint, where we're going. And Secretary Pompeo said that he found that China was forming an international alliance given their economic strength. And he was, and I'm quoting here, he was surprised and dismayed at the number of countries that backed Beijing's crackdown on the autonomy of Hong Kong. And what that speaks to, I think, again, is this competition. Because until now, it was the United States who always had that convening authority. It was the United States who could bring countries together. But now I think what we're seeing is, at least from the Trump administration, the difficulty of pulling those countries together, because now China, through its own economic might and power, is showing that they now have convening authority as well. And of course, we know that's why Secretary Pompeo was in Europe trying to get people on board. So speak to that in terms of what we're seeing play out, because again, looking at closing consulates versus closing consulates, those are just small pieces, but there's a big picture at play. And I think it's important for our audience to understand what's actually playing out.
Yeah, those are all good points, Eric. I have some very specific issues that I will take with respect to China as leader and China as forming an alliance, if you will, against the U.S. I would just say in short that I think that is the fear that both countries have, and that is, can you find a way to compel other states to stay on sides, if you will? You know, for the U.S., it's about rebuilding alliances and partnerships and what that looks like. And China fears that, quite frankly. They fear it, I think, more in the Biden administration than they do in the Trump administration, who's damaged, let's be frank, a lot of these old traditional alliances and partnerships. But I want to come back to this notion of competition, because that's what we hear a lot these days, is that we're in a competition with China, strategic competition with China. And you referenced the point that this is I call it a holistic strategic competition, meaning it, for the first time, at least since I've been watching China, it is on all fronts. It is business and economic, it's technology, even education we see have come under the stress of competition. But oftentimes, you know, I sit back and ask myself, and I'll admit, I don't have the answers to any of these questions, but I'm trying to explore, what does winning look like? Right? What is competition? And, you know, is this a competition that we need to win, or is this a competition that we just need to make sure we don't lose? And these are tough questions, and I don't have the answers to these questions, but I can tell you that inherent in competition is trying not to go it alone. And that's been one of my major issues with the Trump administration, is the fact that the architecture that we built and that we need to compete, however you define competition, certainly includes allies and partners. You talk about Pompeo's trip to Europe, but what is also very clear to those of us who are watching this is that Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi has been calling Europe quite frequently these days. Was just meeting with the Indonesian foreign minister. And his message is, you don't have to choose. Don't allow the US to force you to choose. So China is quite concerned as well that at some point, the US, perhaps under the Biden administration, might get wise about the fact that we need to rebuild these relationships if we think that we are going to have a long-term, sustained competition. I hesitate to say winnable, because I have to admit to you and to the audience, I'm unsure what winning looks like. But I think that's something that we all need to really try and wrap our heads around.
And so when we look at this competition and we look at winning and losing, and I'm not even sure the Trump administration knows what that looks like. But when we look at this issue of winning and losing, and we're looking at it from an economic standpoint, and you have an administration right now that does appear to be looking inward. So for this administration, as it relates to China, is the focus more so on just being able to make sure that you've got companies, you've got corporations that have access to market, and if we have that, perhaps that's good enough. Yeah. But in terms of you know, a larger picture of what a China looks like, because we see China flexing their muscle in the South China Seas, and we see the United States responding in the South China Seas. So there's so many more lanes beyond the economic, although that's a big part of it. But I wonder if these other layers, these other levers are getting the attention, because I think a lot of it feeds into the economic piece and vice versa.
Yeah, a couple of points here that I think are important about the other aspects of the relationship and the competition, if you will. Yes, during the Trump administration, the trade piece of the relationship has gotten the lion's share of the attention, and that's unusual. That is usually not the way the U.S.-China relationship has gone about. But look, we have very capable bureaucrats who can walk and chew gum at the same time. So although we may not be talking about and covering these issues on a daily basis, we've sort of followed the shiny ball, been trade. These other things are still happening in bureaucracy, which gives me a point to say, look, I sit back and using a sports analogy, America's missing sports. It's easy to call in plays from the sideline. It's something quite altogether different to put on your helmet and go out there and try and execute your strategy and defend against someone else. And so, all of my comments today are made from where I sat and what I see, but I'm aware that I don't know all that's happening and all that is going on. And there's some very capable people that work for the U.S. government who is doing a lot of this work that we may not see, because trade is the shiny ball at the moment. But with respect to trade, though, there are some things here that I think is important. Look, we talk about what we want from China. In many ways, that message has gotten a bit muddled over the last month or so, because we talked about during the 301 investigation, we wanted greater access to markets. We wanted China to open more. Today, it seems as though we're hesitating a bit on how integrated we really want to be with China. So the 301 message, open markets, access, and the decoupling message, which is what we're hearing a lot more about today, those are two diametrically opposed things. You can't have greater access to the Chinese market and decouple at the same time. And so I think even there we have a bit of discordant discussions about what we really want, leading me back to my earlier comment. Competition has to be defined and winning has to be defined. What are we trying to win? And I thought I knew what we were trying to do on the trade side, but I guess I'm becoming less and less sure with this greater talk about decoupling. And to be fair, it's not just the US that's talking about this. The Chinese will have you believe that we're the only ones that are discussing decoupling, but they're concerned also about perhaps some of their overdependence, if you will, and you and I have talked about this before, semiconductor chips and some of the other things that they think is strategically important to them. Given where we're going, they also don't want to be too over-reliant on the US. So I don't know if that deeper integration that we started out talking about is where we find ourselves today. I think it's some mixture of two on the trade side. But corporations, I think, are in a tough spot, and no tougher spot than in Hong Kong. The passage of the national security law puts corporations in a position, Eric, where they may actually violate the national security law while adhering to the US Congress's Hong Kong Autonomy Act. And so,
Wow.
When we talk about countries not choosing and countries not wanting to choose, if you sit in the C-suites of an American corporation right now, trying to figure out what you do and how you do it in a way that doesn't trigger a response from either side, quite frankly, is challenging as well. So it's not just countries, but CEOs and boards are having to make these decisions because competition is the name of the game. And whether or not we all understand what that really means, we are competing, whatever that means.
So I want to get into the issue. We've started this big picture view, and we focused on the trade piece. Now what I want to do is I want to talk a little bit about the politics of this relationship, because we know China is a very savvy player. But before we do that, I do want to just make a quick point to our audience. For those of you that are watching and listening, we do want to hear from you. So if you have questions, make sure you get those questions to us, and we'll be certainly make sure that we ask DeWardric your questions on air. Because DeWardric and I can do this all day, and we will. And unfortunately, I might forget about you, but I do want to make sure that we get we do hear from you. But while I'm looking at some of the questions that are coming in, DeWardric, talk a little bit about the savvy of China, because this is, when we talk about competition, and I've seen some of this at play, particularly as we've seen the civil and social unrest in the United States, and you see China trying to take advantage of that, particularly with some of their foreign ministers. Talk about how the political savvy of China and some of their operators, because I think that's equally important. I think that's also having an impact on what we're seeing play out right now.
Yeah, very good question, Eric. And you raise a point that I wanted to at some point get to today, and that was how China played the George Floyd situation and some of the comments that were made there. But to your broader question, look, I think China has made some missteps during these last 3.5 years of Trump. But on balance, what the Chinese have understood is that Trump is an easy target, once you figured him out, to really sort of plan against. And so Chinese diplomacy, which is largely about economic statecraft, has also been about playing on the anti-Trump tropes that are out there all over the world, to be frank. I mean, we just saw a Gallup poll that shows us at about 33% or so, which is about 2 or 3% more likable than China, which is amazing. So all of these things play into Chinese diplomacy. But to be fair, the Chinese have also gone down the rabbit hole with Trump and have executed what I call a tit for tat or countermeasures approach, which hasn't always served them well. So in many cases, even despite how they feel about us, Europeans, the Australians particularly at the moment, have all come to their own conclusions about what China's end game is and how China have treated them. Look, I thought Xi Jinping's speech at Davos, if he had stuck to that frame, which was very much about multilateralism, very much about China stepping into a leadership role and trying to become the responsible stakeholder that Bob Zellett spoke about. If that had been the continued frame, I think we would be in much, much worse trouble than we are now with respect to partners and allies in Chinese diplomacy. But in fact, in many ways, we saw a tit for tat and a race to the bottom. And you have to be careful with Trump because he exists in the mud. He likes blowing things up. And if he can draw you in, and he did with the Chinese, then you do all sorts of things that undermine what I think Chinese diplomacy could have been if they had resisted the temptation to get into this tit for tat, which is still going on, by the way. You mentioned their response with the closure of Chengdu, and we closed Houston. I said on the air, and I've taken a bit of punishment from some on this, I said Wuhan in hopes that people listening to this would get that move would have signaled that you want to put a floor on this and not continue to ratchet it up. Because of what the architecture was like at the Wuhan consulate, that could have been a signal that we don't want this to go beyond this move. But closing Chengdu, I mean, that is literally fire for fire in my view. And so here again, we see this sort of countermeasures and a consistent race to the bottom that makes it hard to really stabilize this relationship and prevent the slide.
And since we're on this issue, and we've seen how the Trump administration has operated and where they have taken China in this game of this battle of wills between the two countries, you've worked in a Obama-Biden administration. I worked with Biden when I was in the U.S. Senate, and my boss served on the Foreign Relations Committee that he chaired at the time. Give us your thoughts, given that we are in a political environment right now. What do you see out of a possible Biden administration versus what we're currently seeing from a Trump administration? And we don't have to get too political, but I want to get your thoughts, having served in an administration where we know Biden was a major player. He brought decades of foreign policy experience. So what would that possibly look like with a Biden administration engaged with China? And would there be a possible reset of what we're seeing right now?
Yeah, good question. Let me do a bit of housekeeping and make it clear. You know this, but I want to make sure that the listeners know this, that I am not a part of the Biden campaign. I'm not on any of the Biden advisory teams. So this is not intended to be a commercial for Biden, but I like Vice President Biden, so that is clear. And look, I think there are going to be some differences for sure. Largely to me, and again, this is me sitting in my seat, having had, I'm not making these decisions, but what I expect we will see differently are the tactical approaches to the relationship. In many ways, I think the long-term strategic direction is set, and I've said this over and over and over again. It is competition. Whatever that looks like, whatever a win looks like, we are competing with China, and this is going to be a competition for the long term. That is going to continue under a President Biden. But what is likely to be different is the way in which the tactical approaches that you take to competition, allies and partners, I think will be a major piece of this. And look, there's lots of work to be done here to regain the confidence from allies and partners. No doubt about it. Even someone as capable as Vice President Biden, who has a lot of these relationships, this is going to be tough to sell people on trusting us again, believing in us again. But we're going to have to do that if we're serious about competing with China. Look, I think putting together some sort of mechanism to manage the relationship, some sort of dialogue process, not dialogue for dialogue's sake. I say these things are not going to have to be restarted. They're going to have to be retooled and restarted because we've gone down the path of dialogue for dialogue's sake. But we do need some management architecture below the president to manage this relationship. And I suspect you will see more of that in the Biden administration. So there's a lot of work to do. I certainly can't give an exhaustive list, but I can tell you that I think you're going to see a relationship where the approach is much smarter, much more multilateral. Smarter, I shouldn't say that. It's going to be much more multilateral than
Tell us how you feel, DL.
That may have been a Freudian slip.
I want to echo something that you said, because when you talked about the difficulty that would be facing a Biden administration, because I interviewed former Ambassador Ruben Brigady about 6 or 8 months ago for a piece that we did for the Washington Diplomat. And he spoke in very stark terms how the international landscape and the norms that have governed basically the rules of the road for the last 60 years have been blown up now, and that it's basically every country for themselves, and that it would be very difficult for a new administration to come in, put those pieces back together, because now the question is, will the rest of the world, will they feel like they can trust the United States again after what we're seeing take place? So he echoed a lot of what you said. And also, I want to thank our audience for all of the questions that you guys are throwing at us right now. They're really great. I'm going to try to get to all of them. And so DL can expound on them. And 2 questions that came in, DL, that I'd like you to talk about. One question asked, what would be the worst case scenario for the U.S.-China relationship in terms of how things could play out over the next 3 to 5 months? And so we see this ratcheting up right now where things stand. What does that mean, and where would that leave us over the next few months, especially when we go into this electoral season and we're seeing every day it seems as though President Trump is saying or doing something that is having most of us scratch our heads. So what are some of the things that we could see that take place over the next 3 to 5 months? In addition to that, if Asia writ large is integral to the United States and to the rest of the world in terms of where we see ourselves focusing on and pivoting to in Asia, how does the U.S.-China relation play or figure into that larger piece? So 3 to 5 months, short term, and then also just kind of like looking at or fitting this U.S.-China piece into the larger component of Asia.
Yeah, all good questions, Eric, by the way. Look, there's an absolute worst case scenario, and no one wants to think about that. And that is some sort of a hot conflict in the South China Sea, given all that's happening there. And that to me would be a worst case scenario if we started to exchange fire in the South China Sea. And again, no one is hoping for that. That is the absolute, in my view, worst case. But there are a lot of things short of that that are also troubling. You know, for me, one of the issues that really worry me the most is if Chinese citizens and US citizens start to become cannon fodder in this competition. Hong Kong is a perfect place for something like that to happen, where you see someone from the US or a foreigner who has violated the national security law, and they come under some sort of extrajudicial punishment as a result of that. That's a pretty bad scenario. I hope that doesn't happen. I'm not rooting, obviously, for any of these scenarios to take place, but those are the worst case. I think also targeting of U.S. companies in China, and there are a lot of them there, as a way to retaliate for what we're saying. You know, we saw this, quite frankly, in Taiwan, with Lockheed Martin being targeted because of a weapons package that we sold to Taiwan. This sort of thing starts to really get concerning for me. And so over these next 3 to 5 months, it's things like that that I'll be keeping my eye on, and hoping that we don't get to that point, hoping that we can manage through this rough patch until we can get some sort of architecture in place to deal with some of these challenges. The competition is not going away, but how we compete, trying to put some rules in place so that this doesn't get too out of control, I think is what I'd like to see personally. I didn't recall the other piece of the question, but I want to make sure.
It was Asia, US,
yes,
China, Asia.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I think we tried in the Obama administration to rebalance the relationship to Asia. We understood, as do this administration, I think, the importance of Asia. They have the Indo-Pacific strategy. Resourcing that strategy, meaning putting the right resources behind it, is going to be important if we think that Asia is important. And to be frank, right now, I just don't see the right amount of resources going into all of the things that we need to do in Asia. But it's not just Asia, it's Latin America, it's Europe. And so when I come back to this question of what Ruben brought up, who you and I both love and respect, you know, he was on to a lot in that conversation with you. When you look at how you're competing with China and where you're going to compete with China, it's important to know what competition looks like, because you want to resource your effort properly. And look, I'm a former Pentagon guy. I love that budget. It's a great big budget. We get to do a lot of things, but perhaps that's not where all the money needs to be spent, because a lot of this fight is going to be diplomatic. And rebuilding the diplomatic core in the US is going to be critical in a competition with China. Trying to staff our foreign policy establishment with people that look like America. So it's not just the message, but the messenger is going to be important as we compete with China. So, you know, all of these things are going to be important in my view. And, you know, how we spend our money is going to tell us a lot about how well we're going to compete, if you want me to be very candid with you about this.
Sure. Last question, and I'll get you out of here on this one. I want you to talk a little bit about Secretary Pompeo. We talked about this offline, and I want you to talk a little bit about Secretary Pompeo's remarks at the Nixon Library last week, and share with our audience what are the ramifications of the statements that he made, because we got a question that also referenced what he talked about. And so what does that mean for the US-China relationship going forward, and what can we expect?
Look, Eric, this in the China space here in the US, this speech has touched off a lot of debate I've watched it quietly and have tried to avoid this at all costs because it was a pretty concerning speech on a number of levels. For me personally, look, I didn't like the setting in terms of the Nixon library. I thought that what Nixon tried to do with his opening of China was a very different day and age, a very different set of goals than what we may have now. So, look, here I am defending Nixon, but I didn't think it was a fair place to give that speech. And some of the content of that speech, I thought pushed it to a point that it makes it very hard going forward if we pursue that path to have any guardrails around the relationship. I mean, he took, some people will say that's fine, but he took after the Communist Party, and in some places in that speech, people would argue he even called for soft regime change. I mean, that to me is very troubling language, because if we know anything about Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party, it's everything that they do is about survival. And so if you make this about their survival, now there's very little that we can talk about and try and address. So, look, we can cherry pick different parts of that speech, but as a general framework, that, for me at least, was some of the most concerning. Before I go, Eric, I do want to just call out, if I can, some of the things on the calendar which could make this relationship even more toxic. Look, I think most people probably haven't started to focus on this yet, but 2022 is a big year for China. They're slated to host the Winter Olympics. They're slated to host the Asia Pacific Games. And China really wants these things to come off without a hitch. We all remember the Beijing Olympics. So some of this international dissonance that we're seeing around COVID-19, which we didn't get a chance to get to. And so I think that if you look at what's coming between now and 2022, 2021 happens to be the 100th anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party. So China likes to have peace in their general vicinity when these big events are happening. To me, that says there's some forcing functions there to try and move this relationship back to a point of balance and ballast, using some of these significant events on the calendar. So I just want to call that to the attention of the viewers, because it is an opportunity, in my view, to really change some of China's calculus, given some of those significant points on the calendar.
We've got to leave it there. I certainly want to thank our audience for tuning in today. I certainly want to thank all of you for sending in your questions. Also, if you would like to see this in its entirety, you can go to our website, and copies also will be available there. Again, I want to thank you, DeWardric, for coming on the program, sharing your expertise. We can do this for the next 4 hours easily, but as always, we never have enough time to get to these issues. So we'll certainly have you back to speak with you in greater detail, because we know this relationship is not only crucial to both nations, but to the world. And we know Absolutely. There's going to be so much more to talk about going forward. Again, I want to thank our sponsors, Cigna and Sohori Insurance, for all of your support on this effort. And do look forward to the next event that we'll be having. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.